About 25 centuries ago, the Greek philosophers asked a pertinent question: what constitutes the universe? And the greatest philosophers of all time, like Thales, Empedocles, Heraclitus, and Anaximander, came up with answers like air, fire, water, earth, and so on. But what constituted these were found by Aristotle to be quite different. Hot, dry, moist, and cold were the four elements. A combination of dry and hot gave us water. A combination of dry and cold gave us earth, and so on. But these did not explain the formation of other substances, and therefore another element was introduced, and that, of course, was the divine element. Sounds funny, doesn't it? But that's how it proceeded. Every doctrine, every hypothesis was a step towards the future. Much later, of course, the ancient Greek civilization was an arena of great debate and discussion on all aspects of science and philosophy, and where answers were sought for all questions. Which is why most of the ancient Greek philosophers are fathers of one or the other discipline.
The marathon, the toughest test of stamina in the Olympic Games. People from all over the world participate in this race to find the best athlete among them. But centuries ago, when the first marathon was run, there was only one participant. According to legend, he ran all the way from Marathon to Athens. His aim was not victory, but bring news of a great victory. The victory of Greek forces over the Persians. For the Greeks, this triumph in 490 BC was the onset of a glorious era, the beginning of the classical age, which saw the highest achievements in the fields of art, philosophy, drama, and architecture. The Greeks were regaining their great Minoan Mycenaean heritage, the Bronze Age civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan culture flourished on the island of Crete around 1900 BC, followed by the Mycenaean culture on the Greek mainland around 1300 BC. These palace societies collapsed, but their heritage lived on. Transmitted through the epics of Homer, a great source of inspiration for the Greek mind. The next great epoch in the Greek history started with the emergence of the self-governing city-states. The predominant issue in the history of the city-states was the relationship between two of them, Athens and Sparta. Both tried to dominate. They formed confederacies against each other, which ultimately led to war, and experimented with different forms of governance. Athens, democracy, and Sparta, oligarchy. Athenian democracy attained its peak under the ruler Pericles. The confidence of the young democracy was reflected in all her achievements, from art and literature to philosophy and architecture. The monumental project to rebuild the Acropolis was undertaken during these years. The Acropolis Ensemble is the zenith of classical Greek architecture. Close to the Acropolis is the massive theatre of Epidaurus. Works of classical Greek playwrights were performed here, which continue to be performed even to this day. But unlike modern adaptations, at that time there were around 80,000 spectators, and there was little scope for subtle character portraits. It was more an exhibition of oratory. Instead of facial expressions, masks were used to depict emotions. In his trilogy, Prometheus, Aeschylus sets the theme of Greek drama. the struggle of human will against destiny. Like all their art, their concern was with human beings. The human figures painted on their vases show the gradual maturation of skill, from profile views to three-quarter and perspective views. But philosophy was the most influential of all Greek contributions. The legendary figure Socrates, whose impact was to last for centuries. But Socrates left no writing of his own, and we can only recreate the events of his life from other sources, such as his disciple Plato. From the academy Plato founded emerged Aristotle, who provided the foundation for the discussion of science, logic, and politics for the next 2,000 years. In sculpture, the Greeks attained perfection in portraying human figures. Most of the original Greek sculptures have been lost, but we can still study them with their copies made by the Romans. When the Romans conquered Greece, they inherited the Greek culture and perfected many of their skills. As engineers and architects, the Romans were bolder than the Greeks, and they built many impressive utilitarian projects. Not much of what they built remain, but even these ruins are sufficient to give an idea of the grandeur of Roman architecture. It was the development of the technique of the arch and the invention of concrete that facilitated Roman building methods. The Colosseum is the best example of their style. But the beginning of this great civilization was very modest. From a small settlement, it grew through a series of military expansions, treaties, and annexations to bring the entire Italian peninsula under her control. In the course of time, she overthrew a monarchy, experimented with a republican form, which broke down by the 1st century BC, and then settled to a dictatorship, which was consolidated by the time of the first emperor, Augustus Caesar. The Greek heritage, which the Romans emulated, spread even to remote continents. Spread of literacy and the expansion in trade made the Mediterranean world one, and the seat of classical civilization of the West. With the development of trade routes, people from remote lands began to meet. The Greco-Roman world is indebted to the civilizations in Western Asia for two inventions which made this rapid diffusion possible.
Western Asia has an old and long history of development of technology, cities, culture, older than does Greece and Italy. Many aspects of culture go to Greece and Rome from here, but two major elements were alphabetic writing and coinage. This Mediterranean world was open to Africa, to Egypt, to the culture of Egypt, to the culture of Carthage that had been destroyed. And therefore you find being open across the Mediterranean, this was an open civilization, as most civilizations are. Civilizations never grow up in small, isolated, and so-called pure cultures which do not receive or give to other cultures and other peoples.
But even this great civilization had its darker sides. We can see by the surviving manuscripts that at the time of the celebrated Athenian democracy, the majority of the population were slaves who were denied any role in the democratic process. The Romans, on the other hand, profited by slavery and used slavery in their imperial expansion. Often this led to rebellions, the most famous being the one led by the legendary gladiator, Spartacus. Slavery in Greece was different, and was more on a domestic scale. The only Greek state to exhibit a similar imperialist tendency was the state of Macedonia, where Alexander was born. His expedition is one of the greatest events in history. In 334 BC, he started from Macedonia, leading his troops, conquering Mesopotamia and Persia. Crossed the Indus in 326 BC, but the exhausted troops forced him to return. Alexander could not reach the Gangetic Basin, land of another great civilization. Urban life was reappearing in the subcontinent after it had collapsed about a millennium earlier in the Indus Valley. New cities emerged from the Vedic tribal society, which was a result of the intermingling of the Aryan-speaking nomadic peoples from Central Asia and local cultures. Studies by the eminent historian Ramila Thapa have revealed that the change started when these nomadic peoples shifted to agriculture.
The big thing about agriculture is that if a community chooses to, it can produce a surplus of food that will look after and maintain people other than simply those who are farming. So we argue that the first tendency towards state formation was this production of surplus food. But food in itself is not sufficient as a surplus, because the process of making a change in society requires that the distribution of the surplus also be given some consideration. And it has been argued that one of the agencies, one of the avenues through which the surplus came to the chiefs was, of course, the holding and the performing of the very large rituals of sacrifice, the yajnas. And by the very large and dramatic ones, I'm referring to rituals like the Rajasuya, the Ashwamedha, the Vajapaya, and so on, which gives extra power to the chiefs, makes them a category apart, and enables them to control the use of the surplus.
This concentration of power led to the gradual evolution of powerful kingdoms, with proper estates and tax systems. A process which was completed with the rise of Magadha. Nothing else remains of its proud heritage, except the walls built by the king Ajatashatru to protect it. With his death in 461 BC, the first attempt to build an empire suffered a major setback. Despite this, this tendency to form large empires continued and found expression with the coming of the Mauryas in 4th century BC. The location of the rock inscriptions of the Mauryan king Ashoka indicate that a large part of the subcontinent from the Deccan to the present-day Afghanistan came under the Mauryan rule. Ashokan pillars and stupas are the first major works of architecture and stone carving. The original stupa at Kaanchi, the brick stupa at Sarnath, where Buddha preached his first sermon, were all built during this period. At Bodh Gaya, exactly where the present-day Mahabodhi temple is located, Ashoka built a small temple about 250 years after Buddha attained enlightenment. By this time, Buddhism and Jainism had become very influential ideas in both artistic expression and social life. For the Shudras, the socially downtrodden, these faiths offered a welcome escape from their low caste status and oppression. For the trading community, it brought recognition. The traders were the donors of most of the Buddhist stupas and prayer halls built during this time. The new sects were less orthodox and put no bar on mixing with strangers and foreigners, which was very essential for the development of trade and urban culture. Ashoka's association with Buddhism and non-violence is often cited as a cause of the decline of Mauryan Empire. But the fact was that, despite the Mauryan rule, which lasted almost 100 years, Indian society remained diverse and regional. Ashoka's philosophy merely reflects this reality he had to face.
He is aware of the fact that people are at different levels of development. He's aware of the fact that people have different aspirations. They're not all uniform. They're not all the same from the north to the south, east to the west. And therefore, he starts elaborating a kind of philosophy of persuasion, the Dhamma, where the emphasis is on social ethics, social responsibility. The good citizen must behave like this, the good person must behave like this, and so on. And I think that this is an attempt to somehow bring the entire empire together into one kind of philosophy, because they couldn't, in fact, administratively make the empire uniform.
Soon after Ashoka's death, the Mauryan Empire disintegrated and gave way to a number of regional dynasties. Architecture and art received a new impetus under the Shungas, who were the immediate heirs to the Mauryas. The wooden structures at Kaanchi were replaced during this time, but the design in stone was a mere copy of the old bamboo railings, which had become a symbol of protection. But gradually the workmen discovered the possibilities of stone. Their skill matured from two-dimensional narrative expression to three-dimensional figures. The period that followed was one of the most exciting epochs in Indian history. The arrival of Shakas and Kushanas from Central Asia and the expansion in trade contributed a great deal towards a tremendous exchange of ideas. The Gandhara style emerged, depicting the images of Buddha, a unique blend of Greco-Roman style with Indian spirit. It was through such contacts and interchange of ideas that the classical style of Indian art developed, which is often associated with the Gupta period. After a lull of about 500 years, the excavation at Ajanta was started again. The prayer halls and monasteries are the best example of Indian cave architecture. But the real marvel lies inside. The murals. The sheer grace, the delicate portrayal and the composition make them one of the greatest achievements of Indian art, which has survived for almost 2,000 years. Perhaps the most impressive of the Hindu style of sculpture during this period is the Great Boar at Udaigiri Caves. The Gupta period saw the acceptance of the Aryan pattern and resurgence in Sanskrit culture, poetry and drama. Attempts have been made to portray the Gupta culture in a monolithic manner, while both artistic expression and administration were very much regional in nature. Large kingdoms were now made possible only in South India, where also the classical pattern was to find expression later. Caves around Madurai, the abode of the Buddhist and Jain monks who migrated to South India for the first time. They compiled the ancient Tamil folk poems into Sangam anthologies, heroic poems, poems of war and love, which also gives clues about the early historic period of South India. The Cheras, Cholas and Pandyas are the rulers mentioned in these poems.
We cannot discuss the political setup of South India in the turn of the Christian era by referring to the chieftains of the period as kings, emperors and so on. There existed no kings, there were only chieftains. The well-known Movendar, Chera, Chola and Pandya were chieftains, and there were lesser chieftains as well, referred to in the poems as Velir, and then below them there existed Kirar. So different levels of chieftains existed, and at all levels the practice was the politics of plunder and then redistribution.
The transition from this tribal social structure to a state system was completed with the emergence of Pallavas and Pandyas. Many urban centers had also developed by this time. The modern city of Kaanchi, famous for its silk trade, and temples, both whose history can be traced way back to the Pallava times. This association of temples with urbanization is a characteristic feature of South India. Most urban centers were consciously developed by the rulers with temples as their centers. At the Pallava temples in Mamalapuram, we can see a variety of rock architecture. From cave temples and monolithic temples which are carved from stone, to structural freestanding temples which are built using stone and cementing material. The relief, Descent of Ganges here, is described as a poem in stone. The natural cleft in the rock is skillfully turned into the cascade of the river Ganges. In the Deccan, Chalukyas, who were the contemporaries of Pallavas, and later Rashtrakutas, promoted architecture and art to a great extent. These kingdoms were constantly involved in war, but artists continued their pursuit. The cave temples contain excellent examples of reliefs and sculptures, including the Trimurti at Elephanta, the best known of all ancient Indian sculptures. The Kailashnath temple at Ellora is an attempt to transcend the cave temple structure. It looks like a freestanding one, but is actually carved like a statue from a rocky hillside. The best example of a freestanding temple in Deccan is a Virupaksha temple at Pattadakal. A superb blend of architecture and sculpture. Its design follows that of the Kailashnath temple at Kaanchi, built by the Pallavas. The iconography of these temples shows that it was a period of penetration of North Indian Vedic culture into the south. The image of Subramanya, the son of Shiva according to Puranic religion, begins to appear here. But in the process, Subramanya merges with Muruga, the warlord of hilly tribes mentioned in Sangam poetry. The folk god, who used to accept blood sacrifice, is transformed and accepted into the Sanskrit culture. Under the influence of Sanskrit poetry, Tamil poets began to write long poems. The greatest among these is Silappatikaram. The Davidian style developed as a result of the amalgam of North Indian and Tamil folk patterns. This classical pattern in Tamilakam saw its culmination with the rise of imperial Cholas in the 9th century AD.
In those ancient and early medieval periods, the farmers could not walk long distances for the exchange system. They did not have quick transport. So such market centers developed within specific agrarian regions called the Nadu. Nadu literally means that area which is cultivated or in which people settle down lead a sedentary life. So the needs of a Nadu were served by a marketplace which came to be called the Nagaram. These market centers, which are called Nagaram, gained greater importance when the Chola state was established in the 9th century. The Cholas had an imperial outlook, and they seem to have specifically paid attention to the development of the Nagarams. But more important is the role of the temple in the development of both agriculture and urban processes. Temple becomes the focus, an institutional focus, and for which the Cholas interestingly used the Bhakti ideology.
The devotion of Bhakti hymns, temple architecture, and art were all used by the Cholas to strengthen their royal authority. The iconography and cosmic symbolism of their temples were aimed at identifying the temple and territory with cosmos, and thus the king with the divinity. The Bhakti hymns continue the tradition of Sangam poetry, but their religious humanism serves a very different purpose in the new situation: devotion to God and also to the king. The cult of Muruga, which is very central to the Dravidian identity, has itself undergone dramatic changes and assimilations and is still changing. It is a process which makes civilization and culture dynamic. It is a process which prevents our icons from being confined to museum showcases, causes it to keep in pace with the changing social situation, living and vibrant.
The Greek and Roman civilizations, which contributed so much to the evolution of human thought, had a slow and gradual period of decline between 200 BC and 300 AD. And the shift took place to Arabia, India, and China, as we shall learn in the next episode.